The topic of death is actually something I've been talking with my son recently, in particular around the thoughts that people keep or the things that we know about it, of how it happens, and reminding him that it doesn't matter how much we might avoid it when our time is, and sometimes we might think certain things really that's there, and there are those moments, and in my personal life I've had a lot of those, and that's why I relate to it in a different manner that maybe some other people do not. And on top of that, there is understanding that it happens to every living being. So it's not necessarily the avoidance of, but the living meaningfully. And there is obviously recklessness in some actions, and those can be unnecessary in different situations. Obviously, in when people are faced with life and death, certain things become less of a question and so on. And again, I speak from my own personal experience and so on. So with all of that, uh, you know, people who have diseases that are terminal, all the way to people for being pursued, myself having experience on both the scenarios, and so much more. Then they understand, including my own actual death, and then sort of resuscitation during surgery, and all of these different things. Then we start to understand how perhaps some choices that we make out of fears are not necessarily always the best. And it is up until we understand our relationship with all of that, that life changes for ourselves and the things that we as an extension are responsible of as. Obviously, it is about adding meaning and purpose and living to a level of joy and happiness for ourselves, also in those that are around us. And there's a balance of what also that means, pleasure and all that. It's not that it's wrong, but it's measured and tempered with many other things that affect our life and the quality of our life and our ability to be able to find pleasure in any of it, if anything. So it is this balance that allows us to have a life kind of that, regardless of how you see pleasure, value, etc., that is in balance. Obviously, those that have abusive, destructive, etc., the likes of tendencies, whether aware or unaware, uh, won't. It doesn't mean the same thing, but that goes without, saying. At the end of the day, if we do not take care of things, eventually you know, they cease to be there. And whether we want to deny it to ourselves or no, or think that certain other actions, you know, will keep us from reaching such reality. That is the free will of everyone and anyone, but it doesn't change what is and isn't. And denying in public might acquire people some sort of visual or maintain some sort of status that they've gained based upon these deceptions, but the reality of doesn't change. And it is only the constant of people denying these factors that allows such things to continue, distract, destroy, take from what actually might add value to society towards a better, future. And all of these things come back to the fear of death too. Because as it is known, with governmental and other things, not just locally but anywhere, it is these things that often hold people back. And I'm not saying it for people to be reckless, but at the end of the day, change in society does not happen through weapons and wars endlessly, but the understanding and acceptance of being able to speak and understand the unity of anything is because everyone is agreeing to it. And few people should not be able to define, especially in such horrific future and manners, the decisions of so many others. Out of fear, everyone participating, and then the few that are very destructive, being able to take over the rest that aren't. And the fear of saying these things or accepting these things or seeing these things because of whatever, it is what keeps it going. And it is a destructive cycle, it's parasitic. And even for those people, it is a cycle with an end. And the planet is far more aware in itself, and that's not cool for anything. If you learn to listen beyond such mental things, then you can understand what I'm saying and the emergency of it. If the planet is not unaware even of these kind of things, the planet try to make us aware of these things. And at the end of the day, the planet has been here far longer than humanity can piece anything of itself. And it goes to say, maybe it is every time humanity leads this way, ends its way. And that's why it's so difficult to understand where it begins and where it goes. That's besides the obvious. You don't have to think about it that way, regardless of what you believe or don't. It applies. It's some basic understanding, and it aligns with anything of any faith or philosophy that at least leads you towards being, the basic law of existence, which is do no harm others while you live in your free will. So, with all of this in mind, then it is easier to understand the urgency of accepting what is valuable and knowing the feelings and emotions we keep, as these things also affect the decisions we make externally and what we allow in our society, in ourselves, in our relationships, and the things that makes us happy or not. Because while certain chasing certain pleasures might distract us, it is not living life to our fullest. And you know denying ourselves these things is not going to change any of that, and it's not going to lead to a future that is even worth wanting to be around. But some serious dystopia because of the fear of wanting to face these things, of being uncomfortable, and perhaps lack of education, lack of experience, I don't know, has led society to this. But it is a constant repeat that when you allow this, and I know lots of people think it's so cliche to say Nazism, but it is a social example of, even if you want to detach yourself from the specifics of it, of when you allow certain mindset to spread and so on and you let it go, how far it can lead. And again, that being one of the most largest prolific destructive ones that has allowed it to spread. And when you are able to identify the priorities of society, and this can be led into a cult of wanting to be more than others at any cost, however you want to relabel it and repackage it, that's pretty much it. It's what has led society where it is, where, an update is just making a screen an inch larger and a different color of a device. And that's very destructive in the sense of, technology advancing and, using resources wisely. And I can go on, but that's a simple example of something in the perspective of how society goes. With all of that, then it comes all back to fear of living fully because we're afraid that at any point, or what others say in some form, is a way of death. Death of how our social views, death of how people see us, death of how we feel, and in a way that cannot be changed back. And I can go on. So that's besides actual death. And it's these fears of not belonging and all of that that often keep people from, and people who do harm are very aware of it. And that's why they know how to package their, fear agendas plus the development of the things in society that allow them to rise over others and, you know, destroy society the way that it is being led. And it is through being aware and practicing and uniting themselves and doing the same. And the lack of people wanting to face these things won't change the fact of where society is headed. And again, changing that about a release of a phone is not going to change everything in society. It's just a way of myself to point. I'm not trying to, uh, single out anything, but it is something to consider. It's not the only product, the electronic or etc. Just from basic things that instead, there are energy shortages, etc. Because these things are take all of that takes on energy and other resources to happen. And to blame it on certain little things and even on poor people getting some stimulus check in the middle of hell, or the poorest of people maybe getting a student loan like in the US recently. Again, student loan is student loan, and spirituality is spirituality. And I say because of the whole reference on my personal things with student in the school of life, and that if people want to be mental and play like that, they're going to attract the worst things in society. You don't gain with that. It's not up to what you wish. It's not a wish well or anything like that. So if again you can see it, people cannot even have a normal conversation about something so destructive because of things like that. And that's the point, bringing it back to what matters, things like that. If you see it wrong with the poorest people getting it, in the who's up to that these things happen, it's the people in society, how those things are built. For example, uh making sure that things that add to society and improvement are things that are prioritized, that people who truly need these things, that schools, etc., book places, etc., are capped at pricing, not just for students who can afford it, but even who cannot afford it, who are to government things, but also even students who can afford it just at the border. Those people too can benefit from having something more fair. And that's up to leadership and the balance of, greed versus. And again, I'm just mentioning a few things. And that's why it's like it's impossible to fix society because, again, you want everything like this for free. You want to allow harm to the people who, offer these ideas, personal recognition, take it for yourself, etc. Well, people have to suffer and so on because everything's at the price of blood and suffering, and that's why society keep going the way it is. People want to prioritize, give attention, etc. to things that harm them, and but at the same time, people who do good things, etc. take from them, but repackage it as I did this, and again continue the cycle. So obviously, that's why everything always ends in the same loop. And it is until all these things are addressed that fears of death and so on cannot be taken, because when you do wrongs in different manners, that all comes back. And it even comes from the fear simply of being taught this, like fear death. But you should be aware of your surroundings, obviously respectful of yourself, your body, others, and thoughtful of all of that. But fear of death finding you itself or doing the right thing shouldn't. Always being thoughtful of what that means. And there is a balance to maintain. And when we are, we can live peacefully knowing that when our time comes, it's not, while it's not the wished, we have peace with it. And saying and standing for the right thing should not come with the price for fear, while at the same time understand surroundings and different things and situations and act appropriately to deal with those things. Understanding that always letting fear dominate and people and things are pushed into that fear, it's not going to lead to a good place, no matter what, how much compliance and so on. There is never enough, because when people gain power through that, they'll always use that as a means to continue to exert that power they have gained. And because that's what it is, and it's until we understand, accept what it is, but not to stay, rather to you know understand how we're gonna deal and handle those things to its actual change, instead of just idling around and you know wondering when something else is, when without accepting our parent responsibility in a meaningful way with others, etc., and not allowing things that shouldn't. It doesn't change. Some things to think about. And then when we accept all those things, we can live much more meaningful in so many ways without also the fear of that death is. Because death is always a thing for all of us, from being sheltered to not. It is to live meaningfully, not recklessly, obviously, because there is also that, and they'll find you dead probably faster, and things like that. So it is to maintain some level of balance. And yes, that's why when we live a life with meaning, often we find ourselves, in a way or not being like if miraculously living almost, even when we experience certain things. And I can say that for myself, there's nothing special I've practiced or done to, for the situations I deal with from when I was small all the way to an adult. And I think it is often to do that meaning. And from the things I've been told from the few people in the past, I can see how, a moment like that could be so meaningful, and how life sort of is like this alignment, just like we can observe it with nature, how every leaf comes out in this particular balance, etc. We don't see perhaps ourselves as being a leaf, in something like that. When something perhaps bigger could see us as just what we can observe on a plant, with how everything sprouts from the seed to full blooming to every leaf, how it comes in a particular order, according to how the cycles of the sun, how how healthy it is, etc., uh, and so on. So with all of these things and the understanding of that, then we understand also how death, like it finds all itself in nature, in all other animals and all other humans. It is includes any other human person who might not feel, very accepting of it and alarmed by it. And the wrongs you've done don't go away just because you feel bad. That's not the price of the wrongs you do, especially when you continue to you and the continuous pretense of avoidance. It doesn't go like that, and it's not about doing favors in the dark and continuing to keep an image. There's no such thing. When you do wrong, and that should be open and known, and people should not be allowed to continue in places of influence when they've done several wrongs. How they're dealt with according to the wrongs comes to the different wrongs and by those people who are affected by their actions, not by those people who have done the wrong either. And that's why it's fair to be open about the things that people do, because society has to know about what kind of things people do in order for society to understand it, have to understand and see it too. For myself, for the things that I talk about that are very out there, that I am affected by, because that's when I started talking about them. I didn't talk about them before, as I was not aware of these people doing these things. But when you start to notice certain things in your life, for myself, I'm a person of having support evidence. I don't like to, and I question even my own observations. And that's why I get slow to situations, to understanding them. But once I do. And there's no me changing my mind, etc. Because I know what I know. I don't lie to myself. In fact, I think I sometimes complicate things for myself because I question my own thoughts and my own observations. Don't go with gut instinct per se. I'm a very like logic, and I need that evidence that goes irrefutably. And when I understand that. And for me, it's like the same thing when I present, and that's why perhaps some people feel like say too much, and that's like when you don't understand, and you can't see the picture, and I have to explain everything. That is my point, and I understand I am affected by a special situation, and I bring that all back because it connects to the spiritual things, and that's why I talk about it. And I also understand my situation too. It supports actually the whole thing about fear of death, because I understand there are people who have power and who have threatened and so on, etc., as I mentioned, and who have taken actions to cause harm for myself and my son in some way. So, with all of that, that's why for one, I'm not afraid. Second, it's not the first time. I come from a difficult background, and that isn't a joke or an exaggeration. In fact, I don't talk a lot about it or in detail because I understand how sensitive a lot of people are to it. No, because they've gone through it, but often because people don't like to hear certain things how they happened. And I'm not talking in the details necessarily of something, but overall the story of how someone has suffered many different ways. And I've been told often to not share after I've been asked to share. So with all of that in time I've understand, and that's why I summarize it in simple terms as it is. It's been years of different things, of multiple things, as I mentioned them before. With all of that, obviously death has been a threat through all of it in several situations. And I've actually had my death experiences. So with all of that, then of course I come from a person that can say has had that experience, and I speak from experience when I said what I said. And with all of that, that's why I explain the things I explain. And I do not fear to speak of the truth in the way that I do. And I think that anybody who actually loves somebody, who respects somebody, acknowledges them and is there for them. And is not pretending that, half in and now and this form of sort of abuse means anything but what it is. So, with all of that in mind, to understand this is to understand what complicates our lives and perhaps what complicates society right now, because society is a decision of the collective, And a lot of people have a very complicated relationship with certain factors and truths about how our society is and so on. So, with all of that, until we understand that talking about these things, facing these things in a manner that are properly dealt with, they won't go away or stop, but will grow worse. It's not going to stop. And that comes with understanding and accepting of what truly means, to not fear death versus being reckless. And there's a huge difference in accepting it. And, finding peace of mind, how it comes with our actions and what we do and don't, and how we feel about that. That brings us to where it does.